Now, if you've decided to write up your paper for publication, there is another format that needs to be followed in order to do that. And this briefly goes over the peer review process that makes sure that your paper represents reality and is not just a hunch that you put out, so that there is a jury of experts that will look over your research, your hypothesis, your experimental design, your data, your analysis, and your conclusion to make sure that this could be reproducible data that could be pursued by another group in order to develop scientific facts that could possibly lead to a theory or an explanation of the phenomena that you were observing. So this is a rigorous process, the peer review process, and it starts with approaching your paper for a review. And you're going to develop the paper according to the CSE guidelines and then hand it off to an editorial office where it'll just get an umbrella kind of a review that looks for your composition and arrangement according to the CSE format, and to make sure that it follows their guidelines. It's not looking at the content. If it seems like it is following all the formats that they are looking for, they'll send it to the editor-in-chief. And he will look at it in terms of interest level, originality, appropriateness for their journal. For instance, if you are writing a paper about thoracic surgery, you do not submit it to the Journal of Gastroenterology, right? So appropriateness. If the paper is rejected by the editor-in-chief, you're done. Try someplace else, or go back and revise your paper. If the editor-in-chief is interested in your paper, that person will assign it to an associate editor who dives down into it a bit more. And that person invites a jury of experts to read the paper several times, take notes, talk to each other, and come up with a recommendation on accepting the paper outright, rejecting the paper outright, or asking for some revisions in between. And once that happens, it triggers another set of reviews. If the journal accepts your paper, it goes to a review for production. If there are revisions, they send it back to you. You make the revisions because you really want to get this published. And then the paper starts again with the peer review system and goes through it with the same experts and reviewers that looked at it from the beginning and that wanted you to make the revisions the first time. You are doing a CSE format that has a title, an abstract, an introduction, methods, results, discussions, acknowledgments. Now, we have talked about how to write up your data collection tables, your figures, your statistics and so forth, and how to put that into play. When you look into a broader format of the CSE, it gets very intense. And this is just an overview of what that format is. We'll gradually get more into this with your lab reports that will follow this format to a T. So this is just an introduction. And when we look at the title pages, you will find that there's more of a structure than you've noted before. You are trying to use the fewest number of words to convey the most information. You are including only the substantial authors of the paper, the people who really did the work collecting the data or analyzing the data or making up the experimental design or reviewing the data. And your abstract comes first. And it's very important. 250 words or less with a brief introduction, a brief scope and purpose of the paper, very key points of the methods, very key points of the results of that paper. Maybe one sentence for the conclusion. You're trying to draw people in and help them to understand your paper very quickly. 250 words or less for the abstract. And then you are looking at an introduction to the paper. After the abstract, you go into a bit more detail about what drove you to study this phenomena and the relevance of your work compared to what is already known about the phenomena. In the first sentence, you really want to talk about the goals of your research. So goals, motivation, what's already known, and how your work relates to it. If you wrote a good introduction, you would know why the authors were interested in this topic, and you would know what is unknown about this topic and the question that the researchers were trying to answer with this topic. The introduction is brief, not as brief as the abstract. Methods. A lot of time and energy goes into writing out the methods. Yes, there's a step-by-step version. The step-by-step version is in well-constructed paragraphs. This is a very technical area of the paper, and you may go to it actually last sometimes because it is so technical. You might want to get a better feel for the paper by going through the abstract, maybe through the introduction to the results section, and then you'll come back to the methods to do the specifics. It's going to give you a lot of detailed information so that you could repeat the experiment yourself. It's going to tell you the sample size, the number of subjects involved. It's going to tell you the types of the subjects involved. Were they male? Were they female? Were they elderly? Were they babies? It's going to tell you the control variables that you have in this experiment. It's going to also discuss the dependent and the independent variables. It's going to talk about how your subjects were grouped and where there was a control group. So I should probably take out that brief description because the method is not brief, and it is quite detailed. The results section. The results section is and I'm just making sure that, okay, I'll lift this up. The results section is a summary of your data collection, and it's divided into two parts. One are the tables, the figures, the visuals. Tables can be visual. Figures are better visuals. And fast interpretation at the top of the results. Then the second part of the results are a summary of those visuals. And here's the big key part. You do not explain the significance of your results in this section. In fact, it should be so apparent from your tables and figures and your summary that the reader should be able to understand the significance of your findings without an explanation. That's how clear you want it to be. You are not putting your opinion into the results at all. In this results section, it's going to be very clear what kind of data is presented, qualitative, categorical, or quantitative, measurable. And it's going to become very clear to the reader without you necessarily discussing the significance of any differences between the control group and the treatment group. If you need a review on control groups, you can go back to the other lecture that's posted. Control groups are that important. And the relationship between the variables that you had as your independent variables that you changed and your results are your dependent variables that changed as a result of your change in days or your change in times or your change in wavelengths of a spectrophotometer. So you want to look for the relationships between your dependent and your independent variables, particularly in your visuals. Very important section, and probably the one that people go to either second or third. They'll read your abstract first, they might go through your introduction, they're definitely going to head for your results section. Your discussion section is where you give your interpretation of your results. And you give your possible explanations for why those results came about. It looks back at the original goal in the introduction to see if your results addressed your goal. And it compares your findings to findings of previous researchers. Remember, every experiment should be reproducible, so you may be reproducing parts of someone else's experimentation. And it discusses inconsistencies or similarities to those other research works. It discusses inconsistencies that are related to your original goals as well. So your opinions and your explanations go in your discussion section, a very important section, but people are definitely going to be looking at the results first, and then they'll look at what you think of your results because they'll come up with their own ideas just by your great visuals. If discrepancies exist between your data and your hypothesis, you want to discuss them here. Any possible error sources, and you want to be very blunt and honest about it. This becomes critical to changing experimental designs and succeeding with your hypothesis on another study. I went over that. You might describe in your discussion section future research. And the discussion section is a conclusion section where you talk about the future as well. So your conclusion, your discussion section is definitely going to relate your data to your hypothesis and look to the future and give your opinions about that. Your acknowledgement section recognizes everybody who got you where you are. Be generous in your acknowledgement section. And your references section makes sure that you're not plagiarizing. So you list your outside sources and your literature that is used. It is critical. And I hope that this covers what you need as an overview for CSE. Talk to you soon.